I'm Lawrence Weschler. I was for 20 years a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine. I quit 10 years ago to become the director of the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU. I guess I do long-form writerly nonfiction and books and magazines, the New Yorker, Harper's, The Atlantic, places like that. And at the New Yorker, we used to say that I covered political tragedies and cultural comedies. And so went back and forth between torture in Latin America and South Africa and Bosnia and artists who drew money and spent their drawings, things like that. So anyway.
I'm Bob Hennelly. I started as a print journalist in the 1970s. I came into this enterprise through the loading dock door as a typesetter, and then took on the responsibility of being a reporter and pretty much worked both in the mechanical and physical part of publishing, and then got more and more engaged in reporting. Have worked in a lot of different settings, which I think is, for a writer, an important education. So my background includes operating heavy equipment, building homes, arts administration, loss prevention, a whole wide range of things that have become really handy. I guess I was always a community-based journalist. And so there was always a kind of accountability because of the scale that I started in. And what started happening, I worked for a couple of municipalities in Bergen County, the Ramsey-Mauer Reporter, got paid 10 cents an inch and $5 if I took the photo. And gradually, as I started, what ended up happening was you, as a reporter, you got larger and larger territory that you had to cover because there were fewer and fewer reporters. And so in a really organic way, over the last 30 years, that's kind of what's been happening to me. So I started working, covering boards of education, planning boards. The politicians would take out public advertising, legal notices in small print, announcing that a forest would be cut down. They'd have the meeting to talk about it. No one would come. The developer would then go cut the forest down. And the next meeting, the place would be packed with hundreds of very angry people. And so this disconnect that I observed between the people who were governed, who were supposed to be participating as citizens, and their government. And so I have to say that that same paradigm has been relevant throughout my work. And so I've continued doing that, and I'm very fortunate to be part of this amazing enterprise here, which is combining both print through the web and terrestrial radio. This very organic kind of journalism where we have this open feedback line. I mean, one call into the station, it's not like when I worked for a newspaper and you had to wait for letters to the editor. There's an immediacy that happens, especially when you write an article online. You don't have to wait to get feedback. So that's kind of my background.
I'm David Tereshchuk. I'm a member of the Community Advisory Board of WNYC, and my main qualification, I think, for being a member of that board, and as it happens on this panel tonight as well, is that I'm a New Yorker, an immigrant New Yorker, but I'm a New Yorker from the great state of the British Isles, and I also listen to the radio a lot. I happen to be also a media practitioner by history. I was a broadcast journalist in Britain before I came here, and well, the one thing I didn't do was radio. So while it's not a professional specialty of mine, it is my favorite medium when it comes to being a consumer. And rather like Bob, I trust in radio's capacity to have that greater link with the community than any other medium, really. Mainly because of its capacity long before we had the web and interactive media for instantaneous connection back and forth between the broadcaster and the listener. The radio phone-in has been with us an awful long time, and in a way the web is just continuing that. My own specialties in the past have, well, they've been pretty consistent from the beginning right up until now. I was an international reporter mainly. torture, but not in Latin America, but in other parts of the world, and a lot of massacres. I ended up being something of a massacre specialist, and not by choice. It just seemed to happen that way. I spend a quieter life now. But one of the things that stayed with me is a passion for international coverage. And if I can just put one marker down now, I think it's one of those really seriously undercovered areas of important news, in every sense of the word, that the media does fall down on, especially in American media, if I can be a little bit critical and superior coming from outside. And I just want to say that the empty chair beside me is for Professor Sri Srinivasan from Columbia Journalism School, and I really hope he comes, because I haven't got an awful lot to say, and I've known him a long time. I've never known him to be late for anything, so I'm fairly confident he'll show up.
So let me ask, any of you could jump in, how should news be covered in your opinion? And how should we decide on what news stories merit coverage?
Larry, would you like to take a crack at that?
You can do it this way.
Well, I mean, I'm more prepared in some sense in terms of what I've been thinking about is what is not getting through. Since that's what I was asked to think about. So I'll just take one example of things that I think that worries me. That there is no doubt in my mind that 30 years from now, when our children's children look back on the years from 2000 to 2010, that will be considered the hinge decade when something could have been done about global warming. And they will look back and say, what were people talking about during that time? And the amount of coverage of 9/11 and the aftermath of 9/11 and the way that completely warped the politics of the country, derailed things, will be the obvious thing to think about. But more to the point, where that puts us now is somehow we haven't been able to make it real for people. And I was thinking about that in the context, I mean, not just NYC, but New York Times, everybody. I failed to mention that in my role at the New York Institute for the Humanities, I'm kind of a political, cultural impresario. I put on events, and I had a similar job for 5 years. 5 years I was running the Chicago Humanities Festival at the same time. And we did a whole festival, 100 events, 5 years in a row, go around global warming, trying to make it real for people. The thing that's particularly struck me here at NYC is having watched how IRA and then NPR generally developed Planet Money to deal with an incredibly complicated subject. And to deal with it with a light touch, funny, when always kind of perks up when one hears the Planet Money people are going to be doing something because they're really smart, and it seems to me that it's time for NPR, and it might as well be NYC, to develop a Planet team that do for the environment. Most reportage on the environment tends to be very new age, and the seals and and off-putting. And there needs to be in much the way that I would have thought that a lot of reportage on financial stuff used to be off-putting. Here at NPR, you had the advantage of having had Robert Krulwich in his days as a business reporter and having set a template. But there needs to be something like that across the board all the time that makes what is clearly the story of our lifetimes real for people in a way that just isn't. And it's a huge challenge, but that would be the first thing I would talk about.
I guess it's important for our standpoint, working in a daily news grind. We actually look at the environment and the question of sustainability as being part of the entire news platform. So when Fukushima happened, I did a piece called Is Fukushima a Pinto? That was months ago, months ago. And now the New York Times has come through and pointed out that indeed it was somewhat of a very expensive Pinto. And so our challenge in terms of the news at the top of the hour is to have journalists who see the interdisciplinary connection between economic sustainability, some sense of economic equilibrium, and the environment and energy conservation. And so I would like you to know that that is built into the discussion of story choice. I'll give you a good example of how a simple fire, where we just had something recently where 3 people, including a 12-year-old, perished in the Bronx. And that was, you heard a 45-second spot, but Cindy Rodriguez and I was spending hours on tracking down this phenomena of people who, because of what's happened in the mortgage crisis, there's about 30,000 2, 3, and 4 family, 5-family homes that no one owns, okay? No one's owning it. Their people are paying rent, but they're not taking responsibility. And so we're delving into what started as a fire story now is talking about sustainability of housing and going out and actually going to the community. We did something, a computer analysis looking at who or where the biggest fines were for people not shoveling their sidewalk. And we did a computer overlay and found that there were whole strips of neighborhoods where the street wasn't being shoveled. And it turned out this was exactly the place where foreclosure had begun to take root. So I'm just saying that your point's well taken, but we're right in the middle of like Indian Point.
I don't see it as a criticism. I just see it as or rather I see it as a criticism of all of us that we haven't yet cracked it.
I think it's because it's separate. Maybe it's the fact that it's sold as, well, now a word on the environment. I mean,
Well,
and I think
but
to your point.
what's interesting is Planet Money doesn't feel that way. For somehow they figured out a way to do that. That Planet Money doesn't feel like this is going to be business reporting. It feels like this is going to be cool. This is going to be interesting. There's going to be kind of and I'm talking about across the board, not just NYC. It's everybody at NPR going up to NPR. But my impression was that a lot of really cool things started at NYC and they moved their way through the system. But if you had something called Planet, just for the sake of discussion,
right,
that your ears perked up, because by the way, it's like totally fascinating and totally interesting and fun.
I guess
it is absolutely fascinating that you've had the worst tornado season and the worst Mississippi flooding and so forth and so on, and that this is completely what was predicted. And yet you don't hear about it in those terms, and you don't hear, and the coverage is all fragmented and not brought together.